Hello, ladies and gentlemen. I am Harry Lawson, and this is the YouTube channel GrecoChess, the channel where we discuss, we analyze, we comment, and we talk about all aspects of the game of chess. In this video, I'm going to show to you a game I played yesterday at the Queen's Chess Club. And first of all, let's give a look at the announcement, the rules of the tournament. Let me share the screen with you. The tournament is called the QCC Amateur Two-Player Team Championship, which stands for Queen's Chess Club, and it works as follows. Players are divided into teams, each team consisting of 2 players, and teams compete against each other. Players need to find a partner, a teammate, to be able to participate, and that is why until the very last moment I didn't even know if I could make it or not, because I arrived at the playing venue, which is in Floral Park, New York, without a teammate. And only at the last moment I was able to find another player in a similar situation, and we formed a team. And because we formed the team only at the last moment, we called our team the last moment. More specific rules, it is 4-round Swiss. It takes place starting from the 9th of January, yesterday, continuing the 16th, the 23rd, and the 30th. What is the time control? Time control is G90 D5, meaning when the game starts, players have 90 minutes on their clocks, but when it's their time to play, for the first 5 seconds, the so-called delay, the clock does not move, and then it continues downwards from where it was before, and players need to complete all their moves before clock shows zeros, otherwise they are timed out. My opponent was Brian Lawson. You may remember I had faced him last May 2025, 8 months ago, at another tournament at the Queen's Chess Club. And his rating, as you see here, is 2000. This is the important number, the irregular. Compare this with mine. Officially, it's 1551. It will go up to 1631 after the December Swiss, but still, whether 1551 or 1631, it is way below 2000. So I knew I was not the favorite, but since I had already beaten a 2000 player in the December Swiss tournament, who knows? We're going now to switch to the chessboard of chess.com, and I'm going to enter the moves. I'm going to copy them from the score sheet, and we're going to see what happened. Brian, by the way, had the white pieces. I had the black. I'm going to enter them one by one, and the computer will tell us what is the score. A positive number means white is doing better, and negative that black is doing better. Tell us by how much, which is the best move, a comment on the move played, and what are the top 5 moves whose player is the turn to come. And Brian starts with the pawn going from d2 to d4, one of the most popular openings for white. Usually to d4 is the most popular, but d4 is very close. And I reply the symmetric way. Usually when white starts, then with the pawn to d4, then black either sends the pawn to d5, the symmetric way, or the knight to f6, the Indian so-called. You see here, this is the queen pawn opening. Second move for Brian, knight goes to f3. This is called the queen's pawn opening Zukerford variation. You'll see here the names of the openings that might change from move to move. Then apply the symmetric way, the knight goes to f6. Queen's pawn opening, the symmetrical variation is called. We still book moves. Pawn to g3 for Brian. It was clear what he wanted. He wanted to fianchetto, place his bishop on g2 and control the long diagonal that goes from h1 to a8. No surprise, I expected it, and I'm trying to block the diagonal by sending my pawn to c6. Till now, you see all of them are book moves. I'll continue for a while with the book moves as Brian completes the fianchetto, sends his bishop to g2, and I send my bishop to f5. And Brian sends his pawn to c4. At the time I was thinking what to do, I decided to capture the pawn, Not in order to be ahead by a pawn, I knew he would take it back, but he would have to waste a few moves until he could grab the c4 pawn. And hopefully I could continue my development. Until now, they call it the queen's pawn opening, the pseudo-Catalan variation. I'm learning these names all the time. And they grab the pawn, as I mentioned before. But the computer doesn't like it. It thinks it's an inaccuracy. It would rather have my pawn go to e6. I was afraid that queen would go to b3 for white because this is usually what I'm facing. And then not only that, it would threaten the pawn on b7. And if I didn't protect it, then the rook on a8 could be in danger. And that is why I thought at least I could postpone any such danger while Brian would be forced to recapture my pawn at c4, try to find some way. And I knew that he would take it with the knight as it happened later. So we completed the first 5 moves, and Brian, after this move that the computer considers inaccuracy, is ahead by 0.65. But let's see how game continued. Knight goes to e5 to threaten the pawn at c4. And now I'm sending my pawn to e6, which before would have been the best move, and now it's only good. Computer would rather have my pawn go to g6. Kingside castling for Brian. My bishop goes to e7. I'm trying to develop as many pieces as possible. Good as a computer would rather have my bishop go to e4. I was really thinking of that because then I block the bishop on g2 and we'll exchange bishop. Either we exchange bishop, or if Brian decides to send his bishop to h3, I have control of the long diagonal. That is why what the computer would have prepared. But I didn't want to play the same piece a second time in the opening. But really, I was thinking about it, and perhaps I was thinking to do it at some time later. Knight goes to c3 for Brian, develops the other knight. And my knight goes to d7. I'm trying to develop pieces. I'm sorry, that will come later. At that point, I castled myself. We're both trying to develop and castle as early as possible. And now Brian is going to take the pawn with the knight. I expected this thing. At some point it was going to happen. In fact, I expected it earlier. And now that the knight has left, I'm going to send my knight to d7. And without the pawn at c4, my pawn at e4, Brian can send his queen to b3 and threatens my pawn at b7. The question is how to stop it. And I decided to stop it by sending my knight to b6, which the computer believes is the best. And we completed the first 10 moves, and Brian is ahead by 0.48. It's not that big. It doesn't yet decide the game, but when you're 300-400 points below your opponent and the opponent starts with an advantage, you know that chances are the advantage will not likely go down. Let's see how game continued. Knight goes to a5 of Brian's from c4 to a5, and now threatens again my pawn at b7. If I'm not careful, I can lose it, and not only that, my c6 pawn is going to be an isolated pawn. I try to defend it by sending my queen to d7, but the computer would like me to inaccuracy is the computer, because the computer would rather have me take the d4 pawn with my queen. It was free for taking. Of course, then Brian would take the pawn at b7. Or at least that's what I'm afraid, although the computer would rather have the knight go to d1 and threaten my queen. I was also afraid of threats to my queen. Yes. And then, yes, Brian would take the pawn. I was afraid that I would open what's called the Pandora's box if I took the pawn d4 with my queen. Queen in the center could be attacked in many different ways. That's why I prefer to defend the b7 pawn, even though the computer calls it inaccuracy. Bishop to f4 for Brian, and it's a great move because good is a computer, but I really felt very scared because it controls a lot of crucial squares b8, c7, d6, e5. This means that I cannot place any of my rooks on b8 to control the b file. And that's why I really didn't like it at all. But if I was thinking to place my bishop on d6 exchange, but then knight goes to b7 attacking the queen, and I'm a pawn behind, and so I didn't like this continuation. I place my knight now on d5, attacking the bishop on f4. Brian takes it with his knight on c3. And now I have two ways to change it. I do him to take it. Mistakes is a computer. And believe it or not, now I am ahead. From 0.48 for Brian, now I'm ahead by 0.67. Now, how can I take back the knight? I can take it either with my knight on b6, but then I lose a pawn on b7, or with a pawn, and I create a wonderful chain b7, c65. So I decided to take it. In fact, I have two pawns to take it. I decided to the e6 instead of c6 to create the chain b7, c65. And that's what I did. Brian sends his queen to c3 to exert pressure on the c6 pawn. My knight goes to a4 and attacks the queen on c3, and also the pawn on b2. Queen goes to d2 and not only saves herself, but also protects the d2 pawn, and protects the d4 pawn just in case. And now what can I do? I don't like the bishop, actually the knight on a5 attacking my pawn on b7, this, and I don't want to have a queen just to protect the pawn, but I know if I lose this pawn, my c6 becomes backwards and things can become very nasty for me, especially when facing a 2000 rated player. So I send my bishop back to d8 to attack the knight. And we continued the first 15 moves, and believe it or not, I am ahead by 0.42. It's very small advantage, but to face a 2000 rated player and have an advantage is quite important. But can I keep it? Brian places his pawn on b3, attacks my knight on a4. Uh, If I attacked Brian's knight with my pawn on b6, then his knight is also lost. But then he would take the knight. I would take his knight and then the queen. No, the queen cannot take my pawn. There's a bishop. I was thinking about it, but I decided let me first save my knight by placing my knight on b6. And the problem with my knight on b6 is a save. In fact, there is no other square where my knight could be saved, but now I cannot push the pawn from b7 to b6 and attack the Brian's knight. Otherwise, if the knight is attacked, then in a5 it's lost. Perhaps I could send my knight to c8 and then a pawn, but this takes too much. Let's see. Brian wants to have more pressure on the c file since the semi-open as it's called, because there's only one black pawn and no white pawns. So sends his rook to c1. And I'm taking care of the other semi-open file, the e1, with my rook going to e8. Now Brian decides to contest the e-file, sends his rook to e1. And I decide to contest the long diagonal from h1 to a8 by placing my bishop on e4. If inaccuracies, as I say, is a computer, but I was feeling that what are the choices of Brian? Either we exchange or he gives me the diagonal if he sends his bishop on h3, I doubt it, or he can attack my bishop by sending the pawn to f3, which the computer says is the best move, but then he's blocking his bishop on g2. He suddenly becomes a bad bishop, which would be nice for me. And that's what Brian did. He attacked my knight by placing my bishop by placing his pawn on f3, and my bishop goes back to g6. My bishop is safe, controls not the longest, but let's say the second longest diagonal, goes from b1 to h7. Many crucial squares are covered there. For example, his rooks cannot go to b1, or his queen to c2 or d3. Many crucial squares are covered, while the bishop on g2, Brian's bishop, is a bad one, blocked by the pawn on f3. That is blocked by the bishop on f4, cannot even continue. Brian sends his pawn to e4, starts expanding, and I place my bishop on c7. I want now to exchange bishops. Computer thinks a mistake. What I was thinking is that if knight from a5 went to b7, because the pawn seems to be unguarded, then bishop c7 takes a bishop on f4. Brian takes back either with the pawn on g3 or the queen on d2, and then my queen on d7 wins the knight on b7. But overall, the computer thinks it's a mistake. And that is why after the 20th move, Brian is ahead by 0.63. Again, the margin is quite small. Still, the game is still for grabs. You never know what will happen. And now Brian does what the computer is recommending. We exchange on c7. In fact, the computer recommends this one here, although here it's only the second best move. We exchange on c7. At least I don't have to worry about the dark colored square, like the dark colored, bishop of Brian, that f4 that controlled a lot of very crucial squares. Pawn to e5 for Brian. It's not yet a pass pawn because there is my pawn on f7, but it is near becoming a pass pawn if I'm not careful. For example, if I move my pawn from f7 to f6 or f5, immediately Brian pushes the pawn to e6 and it's a pass pawn. It may not be very stable, but at least he has a pass pawn. My knight goes to d7 to attack the pawn on e5, but attack not really because there's a pawn on d4 that threatens it. Pawn to b4 for Brian, and my queen goes to b6. There is a catch here that my knight, if I could play again my knight from d7, would take the pawn on e5, and Brian cannot take it back with his d4 pawn because it is pinned. If he takes the rook, I take the rook with e8, and again the pawn on d4 is pinned. So if Brian is not careful, he can easily lose the e5 pawn, which is the most advanced pawn that he has. But unfortunately for me, Brian saw it. And he places the king to h1. In case you wonder, why did he just do a little move like that, placing his king to g1 from g1 to h1? It is so that the pawn on d4 would not pin any longer and would provide real protection to the e5 pawn. My rook goes to c8, from a8 to c8. Computer doesn't like it. I want to contest the other semi-open file too, but Brian found a nice move, bishop from g2 to h3, and this move both attacks my knight at d7, and if it's moved, we can go b8 or f8. Then my rook on c8 is lost. Fortunately, I saw it, and that's why I moved again my rook from c8 to d8. And now if Brian takes my knight, then the rook takes a bishop. We completed the first 25 moves, and Brian's advantage a little bit larger. It is 1.11. He starts building the advantage little by little. Let's see how this will continue. Brian will send his rook to c1. Now that my rook had to leave the c file, Brian takes over the semi-open c file. My knight goes to f8, so I don't have to worry about my rook on d8 protecting the knight on that was before d7. Otherwise, the knight would be lost for nothing. Brian moves his knight from a5 to b3. My knight goes to e6, blocking the bishop, so I don't have to worry about squares d7 or c8. Not only that, I was even thinking if it would be possible to attack. I was attacking the pawn on d4, but did I have enough firepower? It was attacked twice by knight and queen, defended twice by knight and queen, so not yet. But at least this could constrain his knight on b3 and the queen on d2 not to move, otherwise he is losing the d4 pawn. Brian decides to start an attack along the queen side with pawn going to a4. This is what's called a minority attack because he has 2 versus 3 pawns or 3 versus 4 pawns on the queen side. My queen goes to c7. I was afraid of a pawn going to a5. And then my queen is not in a good shape. Also, I want my queen to not to have to withdraw to the c5 because there's a rook on c1. And I wanted my queen as fast as possible to leave this dangerous area. Brian sent his pawn to b5, and now I have to be careful. I cannot use my c6 pawn to take on b5 because then Brian's rook on c1 will win my queen at c7. That is why my queen goes back to b6. And not only that, I'm ready to win the pawn. If I could play again, pawn c6 takes b5, pawn e4 takes, the queen takes it. But Brian saw it and sends his bishop to f1. And my rook goes now to, in accuracy, the computer, my rook goes to c8 to protect, to give more protection to my c6 pawn. And we completed the first 30 moves. Brian advantage is a little bit less now. Before it is 0.92. We finished 30 moves. The game becomes more and more exciting. Still, you see that both sides have almost all of their pieces. We have only grabbed from each other one pawn, one bishop, and one knight after 30 moves. Brian sends his pawn to a5, attacks my queen on b6. And my queen, I don't want it on c7 because of the rook on c1. So I send my queen on d8. Computer would rather have my queen go to c7 here. But the difference is very small. Pawn to a6. Brian continues his minority attack and he's near promotion. I don't know what to do here. I send my queen to b6. Computer doesn't like it. Thinks it's an inaccuracy. Would rather have the pawn on b7 take on a6. And maybe I should do it because the Brian's pawns are near promotion, are coming closer and closer to the 8th rank. Brian will use his pawn to take on b7. And now I have no choice. I must take it. The rook is starting on c8, and if I don't take it, then you see the pawn on b5 taking on c6, and you have connected past pawns near promotion. Forget it. So my queen takes on b7. Inaccuracy says the computer would rather have my rook take go to c7. And now you see that Brian's advantage becomes 2.31, quite important from now on. Knight goes to a5, threatens my queen on b7. Great moves in the computer. My queen goes to b6. So it is not attacked by the knight. It's not going to be grabbed. And it's not also on the rook's line. The best is the computer. And now I see that I have a problem. My pawn is attacked 1, 2, 3 times and defended only twice. I'm going to lose the pawn on c6. And I knew it then that things started becoming ugly for me. Because knight takes on c6. And my queen cannot take the b5 pawn. I wish I could do it because in this case, The knight is here unprotected, but there's a bishop on f1 that doesn't allow my queen to take the pawn on b5. What can I do? Knight goes to c7, attack the pawn on b6 once again. So the pawn is attacked twice by my queen, and my knight is protected only once by the bishop on f1. We completed the first 35 moves, and now really Brian's advantage becomes important. 3.05 as you see here. I know now it would be very, very difficult to come back with anyone, and especially a player that is, depending how you count it, about 400 points higher rated than me. But I wouldn't stop fighting. Let's see how things will continue. Brian sends his bishop now to h3, attacking my rook on c8. And the rook, I felt at that time almost hopeless because where could my rook go? Of course, c7, my knight blocks the c file. b8, d8 is covered by the knight on c6. I was going to lose an exchange, and after thinking and thinking and thinking, I found that there is one square where, at least for the time being, the rook is not going to get lost, and I send it to a8. Not only that, I also give more protection to my a7 pawn. Bishop goes to d7 for Brian and attacks my other knight on e8. Where can I do it? What can I do with that? Cannot go to e8, c8, b8. They're covered by bishop and knight. There's only one square remaining to f8. Computer would rather have my knight taking the pawn and losing the exchange because things were becoming so bad for me. I would win the exchange for, excuse me, I would give up the exchange for a pawn and might have some chance to survive. And Brian did what I was expecting to do. His knight from c6 goes to e7. And the only good thing for me is I don't need too much time to think about the response because there's only one legal move for me. So at least I'm not spending any time for that. King goes to h8, the only move. You see here, it is forced. Now I was expecting Brian to take my bishop on g6. And I was thinking take it to the f7 pawn or the h6. If I take it to h6, queen goes to g2 and mate on h3 is unavoidable. That's why if he would take my bishop on g6, I would take it with my pawn and open the f file for my rook. But Brian did not do it. Instead, he sends his rook from c1 to c6 and attacks my queen. And now, I was thinking, what could I do? My queen could take the pawn on b5, but then the rook could go could move his rook, for example, to d6, and my queen is threatened by the bishop, and his rook and queen can do can threaten a lot. There's a discover threat for my queen. That is why instead of that, I send my queen to b7, which the computer thinks the best possible move. Rook goes to c5, O'Brien, and threatens my pawn on d5. The knight threatens, the rook threatens, defended by my knight and by my queen, barely defended. And my rook goes to d8 to threaten the bishop on d7. Inaccuracies as a computer. And at this point, almost everything loses. But now, instead of being down by about 3 points, I'm down by 4.68. We completed the first 40 moves. Now I'm down by 468. And of course, in the game, I didn't know it was so much, but I felt things are not turning good for me. And this really, and I felt even worse when Brian placed his bishop on c6. And this is, what can I say? It is it kind of a skewer because my queen on b7 is attacked, and if it moves, I lose my rook on a8, but minimize damage. My queen goes to b8. Computer would rather have it go to b6, but nothing will change. And now Brian takes on a8. If I take it back with the queen, I have two ways to take it back, either with the queen or with the knight. If I take it with the queen, I lose my knight. I'm already down in exchange, so let's take it with the knight. Computer would rather have me counterattack the rook by sending my knight from c7 to e6. But I take it with my knight, which is none of the good moves. And now things become even worse. Because now Brian is going to send his knight on c6. And now I saw it. There was a fog. Knight on c6 attacks both queen on b8 and rook on d8. So I'm going to lose a second exchange. My queen goes to b6. What else can I do? Because Brian takes my rook. Queen takes a knight. Rook goes to c1 for Brian. Doubles his rooks on the c file. I have no rooks to contest it. And my knight goes to b6. I don't want to be at the last rank. Give some extra protection for the d5 pawn. And at this point, we completed the first 45 moves, and you see that Brian's ahead by 5 pawn 32. He has materially, he has one extra pawn. No, materially, he has one pawn and two exchanges. That's why you see the +5 here. I knew things were becoming not good for me, to put it mildly. Brian will send his queen at a5, attack my pawn at a7. What can I do? I was thinking. My knight cannot go anywhere because then my queen on d8 is lost. Also, there is a threat of the rook going to b8. Excuse me, I'm sorry, from c5 to c8, and then my queen is pinned. So I decided to put my queen to b8, and in this case, the knight cannot check here because the knight will take it. But you see here, there is m3. This is making 3 moves. Unfortunately, I accelerated the end, although I don't think I could have survived it either way or other. And Brian checked me with the rook on c8, and then I saw it. If I took the rook with my knight, queen goes to d8, eats a mate. If I took it to the queen, you see here the combination, knight to c8, queen to d8 mate. If I took with my queen, rook takes it, knight takes it, and queen goes to d8 a mate. This is move number 47, as you see here. And both of us had exhausted almost all of my time. At times I had a little bit less than 2 minutes. And since I had already lost the game and it was not that critical, and since time was not my problem was my position, I continued writing the moves until this point where I resigned. Stopped the clock, shook Brian's hand, and congratulated him. Brian, congratulations, very good win. And after the game, he told me that since last May when we played, I have improved a lot. Thanks, Brian, for the nice comment. And now let's see the review. What does the computer think about the game? You see here that until approximately this point was even. At some point, I even had a small advantage, but little by little, Brian started dominating. Brian had 91.2% accuracy, I had 81.1, and we played as if his rating was 2450, way above his 2000, and mine was 2250, way above even my 1631. I'm happy the way I played. Of course, I wish I had a better result, but at least I'm happy that I fought, and at least for the first 30 moves, the game was more or less even. It was only decided after Brian started his minority attack by pushing his a pawn, and even then, it took some time. I think from 33rd move, basically, he started really being ahead. And how did we do? No brilliant moves. Brian had 2 great moves. They had none booked, 5 versus 4 for Brian. Best 16 each of us. Excellent. 8 for Brian, 5 for me. Good. 10 for Brian, 8 for me. And in the negatives, in accuracies, 6 for me, 3 for Brian. Mistakes, 5 for me, 2 for Brian. 1 with each of us, and no blunders. And in the other couple, my partner Ethan Guo lost his first game from Ira Cohen from the Copec Knights. So our team lost 2-0 in round number one. Of course, both of us were rated way below our opponents. I'm happy that at least I played quite well, especially against a 2000 rated player. I fought the game for most of it. And next Friday, the 16th, is round number two. That's all for now. Let's see how the tournaments are going. A very brief look. I don't think anything has really changed in grecochess. You see here the same two players, Maxim Govorukha versus Barak 7. The last two games, we're waiting for them to be completed. And in Moonlight Underwater, the second round has just started with a few games have been completed. If nothing unusual happens, we'll continue facing the bots. I'm happy that I was able to participate in this tournament, find a partner, played quite well in spite of the result. And let's hope that if I have different opponents in the next rounds, I can do better than that. This is Kari Anaziris. Thanks to all the viewers, subscribers, the likes, and the comments. This is my YouTube channel, Greco Chess. And for now, goodbye.